We are also delighted to have with us Laure Baudrihaye Gerard, who is the legal director of Fair Trials Europe. Fair Trials is an international non-profit organization campaigning for fair and equal criminal justice rights. Laure is based in Brussels and leads the work of Fair Trials in Europe. Before, she was working for more than 10 years as a legal practitioner in England and Wales. She will present a specific study of fair trials on victimization in detention. Laure, we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Edith. Thank you for the introduction. I'm just going to share my presentation. Can everyone see it? Yes?
Yes.
Perfect. So thank you again for the introduction, and thank you to Willem, to Europris, and to the European Forum for Restorative Justice for organizing this webinar exploring the intersections between victims' rights and offender rehabilitation, and for involving fair trials. And I'm very honored to participate and to present to you a project where we explored how the Victims' Rights Directive could help promote access to justice for people who have suffered violent crime during their detention. So blurring the lines here between a victim and an offender and addressing a specific but sadly common situation where someone in detention is a victim of violence. So it's really about showing connections between detention and victims' rights, and more broadly trying to help shift away from a punitive culture of detention. And I think, but this is very much beyond the scope of the project, so I won't presume to be able to help you much on prisoner rehabilitation, unfortunately. But for everyone here, it's something I think to keep in mind, because I think that it could be something key to support reintegration of people when they exit detention, which can in itself be traumatizing, but especially so if you've been a victim during your time inside, victim of abuse, of crime, and of other abuse. So I'll can you see the next slide? Sorry, I'm struggling a bit here. Are you seeing my slides, or?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of structure for my presentation, I'll give you a brief overview of the project and then run through the specific context of detention, the key elements of that context, and then look at the implications of that context of detention on the rights protected by the directive, and then outline a few solutions that we'd identified. And I'd really love to hear from you on in particular restorative justice solutions in this context. So by way of introduction, what is the problem that prompted this whole project? So violence which is prolific in detention. The World Health Organization, for instance, in 2014 highlighted that about 25% of prisoners are victimized by violence each year, with a number experience sexual violence. We also have US government statistics which show that men in detention are 18 times more likely to be assaulted than men in the general population. And for women, that rate is more than 27 times higher. And in fact, you may have seen in the news, I think it was yesterday, the reporting and the horrific footage of the abuse that women in a prison in New Jersey encountered routinely, sexual abuse and beatings that appeared to have been prolific for years. And now the head of the prison system has resigned, and there's a plan to shut down the facility, and 10 agents are being prosecuted. But this is no doubt not a US specific problem. This is happening everywhere, including in Europe. Europe, where we see overcrowding across prisons. And I'd like to pause here because this is a hugely important issue, overcrowding. It's a persistent problem in Europe. in 2020, statistics showed that in EU member states, 8 suffer from serious overcrowding, 3 from overcrowding, so where you have more than 100 prisoners per 100 places, and 8 are in a situation of imminent prison overcrowding. So that's huge in the EU, a huge problem. And we've seen some temporary reductions in prison populations during the pandemic, but increases have been seen again. So it doesn't appear immediately as a sustainable reduction in prison populations. And we have, in fact, a number of pilot judgments from the European Court of Human Rights concerning the prison overcrowding situation in 10 member states, and asking member states to, requiring member states to take action on that. And why is it so relevant to violence in detention? Because according to the experience of the Committee for the Prevention of Torture of the Council of Europe, overcrowding causes all sorts of issues, not only cramped, unhygienic accommodation, constant lack of privacy, reduced activities, including reduced access to healthcare services, but also overcrowding increases tension and creates more violence between prisoners and staff. So there's no doubt that despite the lack of data in Europe, that violence is happening behind bars, behind the prison walls, and very much out of sight. So I say there's very limited data because there's very limited reporting, and even so, very little prosecution where there is reporting. We've seen a lot of investigations being very quickly dismissed for lack of evidence. So this project really was conceived to understand whether the directive's rights are accessible and enforced when people suffer violence in detention. And we brought together partners from different countries, so Redress, who typically work on redress for victims of torture, who did the research in the Netherlands, Antigone, very active in prison monitoring in Italy, civil rights defenders in Sweden, the Center for Peace Study in Croatia, the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, and ourselves, where we coordinated and also did the research, the local research in Belgium. And we focused on violent crime, but our findings apply to violence in all its forms, and it is a very complex notion in itself, as you know. So we interviewed stakeholders, very diverse group of stakeholders, and also met victims of violence in detention where that was possible. Now we focused on detention at pretrial on the one hand, but also detention in an immigration context. So the findings were quite similar in both situations. So where states are holding people who are not in a regular situation in detention, and also where people are being held before their trial in detention. And so our research took 2 years. We published our findings in 2019. I put the link there to our report. I could also add it in the chat. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the Commission again, as this was at once again an EU-funded project, such as under the Justice Programme, as Elena mentioned earlier. So the context of detention, the very specific elements of detention, and I'd like to highlight 3 key elements, but there are more, of course. And the first one is what we call the conceptual dichotomy, which has been, I was very happy to hear, picked up by the previous speakers as well, and highlighted in that context in their presentations, where we really see that both our societies, but also our criminal legal systems are very much based on this dichotomy between, on the one hand, victims of crime, and on the other hand, offenders, people presumed to be offenders, and who may end up in detention on the other. And this representation is so deeply ingrained in the conversations we had that it's very difficult for stakeholders to see people who are detained as people who may also be victims. And we saw that in our interviews with various stakeholders, where there was a real difficulty in even understanding what the topic of our research was. So real difficulty to see where rights of victims and detention may coincide or overlap. And this obviously has very serious implications on the ability of detained people when they are victims to access and to exercise their rights as victims. And to start with, detainees themselves may not perceive themselves as victims. On the one hand, and on the other, the stakeholders who come into contact with the detainees, even those who are supposed to protect their rights in detention, monitoring bodies, for instance, prison monitoring bodies, may not see detainees as potentially also victims. So we noted a general lack of awareness of victims' rights amongst practitioners working within the prison walls, amongst detention staff, amongst medical staff in detention, lawyers, criminal defense lawyers in particular, who obviously go into detention to advise and to work with their clients. Monitoring bodies, as I mentioned, support services for detainees who work in detention, and civil society as well, who is active in detention. And in that situation, what is so frightening to see is that this conceptual dichotomy is in fact participating to some form of normalization, or in banalisation in French, of violence in closed institution, as if violence is just part of being detained, being hit in the face, being punched, thrown against a wall is just part of being detained. So it is an absolutely key element. Now, the second key element I wanted to highlight is around isolations, because it's incredibly difficult for people who are detained to communicate with the outside world, obviously, particularly at a pre-trial stage, when you tend to be held in conditions that are often worse than once you are sentenced. And we noted that detainees often express a lot of fear of talking, fear for their livelihood and safety within the prison walls, and they're just waiting it out until they can get out. What came out was very much a dependency of detainees on staff who can also be their aggressors, and this isolation coupled with the dependency makes the risk of reprisal a reality, and something that provokes genuine fear. So this extreme dependence may dissuade, and in many cases dissuaded, detainees from reporting crime and filing complaints, even once they exited detention, and which contributes to increasing this very specific vulnerability. Now, this context also makes it extremely hard, if not impossible, to report crime internally, but also to the police. And so what we noted as well is that there are very limited communication channels that are very difficult to access. For instance, a phone in detention may be the phone in a corridor where guards can overhear conversations, or other prisoners. So there are very few confidential means of communication with the outside world. Even speaking to a lawyer is difficult, because often lawyers, by the time they see their client, have very little time to focus on their client. They focus on the criminal proceedings at hand. They do not, they do not investigate what's happening with the more generally during the detention. And also in many prisons, there are no confidential spaces for detainees to meet their lawyers, or very limited. So communicating is very difficult, and then obviously also accessing evidence is almost impossible, in particular evidence about the use of force, about violence, and specifically in that context, accessing medical evidence. Medical reports are the holy grail of proof of violence, and here we noted in our research how difficult it was for detainees to access medical assistance, just in terms of their own well-being, but also in terms of showing that they've been a victim of violence. So the third key contextual element that is very much specific to detention are these conflicts of interest, what we've called the conflicts of interest. So there's a sort of self-protection between different bodies, resulting in a law of silence, a rule of silence, or some have called an omerta, where no one speaks out. And this is something that we saw at various levels, reflexes of self-protection of those working within places of detention that can foster a rule of silence, and something that was picked up some time ago already by the Committee for the Prevention of Torture, that describes very much this esprit de corps, a willingness to stick together, but that means often covering up illegal acts of colleagues. And it's something as well that was very much emerged, for instance, in this trial that's coming out in New Jersey, where there was a very much a situation of cover-up of the violence that had been occurring systematically in this women's prison. So this creates a vicious circle in terms of lack of accountability, which creates a climate of impunity, which in turn promotes a recurrence of violence and further discourages reporting. So crime remains unreported and victims remain undetected. So how does this impact rights under the directive? Well, in order to access rights, to obtain support, protection, legal advice, the different rights that Levent outlined, a victim must first be identified and recognized as such by themselves and by the different authorities. They must be on the radar. And in many EU member states, this can happen through the police, for instance, who may act as a gateway to victims' rights, or to outside stakeholders, victim support organizations and services who can help victims get the support and the information they need. But inside, police is not present, or they're only present to uncover offenses, drug, for instance, trafficking in prison, and also they're not necessarily trusted by detainees as being persons that detainees can speak to. And when it comes to victim support group, obviously they are not present in the countries we researched in prisons. And so for these systemic reasons I outlined, detained persons, when victimized, will rarely report crimes committed against them, and let alone file complaints to the police. So the obstacles are these fundamental barriers to filing criminal complaints, the difficulties in accessing evidence of violent crime in detention. The challenges in proving that the use of force is illegitimate, because in many cases the use of force happens in the context of a disciplinary mechanism of putting down a rebellion by a detainee, and so but that use of force can be disproportionate and can turn into an illegitimate use of force, but it's incredibly difficult to prove this. We also noted limited access to legal advice and to support, and that violence tended to be dealt with through internal complaint mechanisms rather than any reference to external authorities. And generally, that people also face a lack of political or institutional will to investigate and prosecute these situations. So victims in detention remain under the radar. This means that in practice, our research showed that none of the directive's rights are accessible to detained victims. They're just simply not implemented in the context of detention. And just focusing on a few key rights, the right to information, for instance. Obviously, without information about your rights as a victim, it's very hard for a victim to know that they're there and therefore take them on and exercise them. And in practice, we did not find cases where detainees are informed of their rights as a victim at any stage in their detention. Another key right that we looked at was the right to support And here again, the existing framework for victim support services is simply not adapted to victims in detention. And the different organizations that provide services do not typically enter detention facilities. So we don't have that ability to access support services. And then other key right is the protection from further victimization, because as I mentioned, the risk of repeat victimization, of intimidation or reprisals in detention is very high. And the range of retaliation measures that potentially staff could use against detainees is very wide. It can be, you know, where detainees have a certain access to a certain job within the prison, as is the case in Belgium, for instance, they may be removed this job, this role, which is in very high demand. They're very few, and it's in very high demand. So reprisals, even in that sense, you know, are very wide and may impact the physical and mental integrity of people in detention. So ways forward. In our report, we made several recommendations, and generally, so Elena already outlined the strategy on victims' rights, which we really welcomed. And there's a need more broadly, obviously, to work on the implementation of the directive across all different groups of victims or individual victims, and there's definitely a need to address this problem by better applying the EU rules in practice. And we welcome in particular the recognition that detainees are among the most vulnerable groups that require particular attention and scrutiny from member states. And so it's a very important time to be having these discussions as we're having today, and bringing people together, different stakeholders, to think about workable solutions, as Elena mentioned. And but just this recognition in the strategy of detained persons as a particularly vulnerable group is a hugely important shift in how the EU is leading, and how the EU and member states might approach detainees and detention, and we hope that it can help shift the culture of detention that we're seeing, and push member states out of inaction. Just last week as well, the French civil society, the Observatoire International des Prisons, issued another call based on the Commission's victims' rights strategy to the French government, a call for action to address this this violence that has been reported over years and years and years, that happens across French prisons as well. So it's a very key leadership position that the EU has taken, in our view. Now, in terms of solutions, the first, very much to recognize the problem and document it. Bringing rights behind bars starts by acknowledging, recognizing the specific vulnerability of victims in detention, and bridging this conceptual gap between victims and detained persons. And solutions need to be adapted to the specificities of detention context, which I outlined before: the isolation, the fear of reprisal, the rule of silence, in particular. We also need to create safe channels for reporting, externally towards authorities or stakeholders who do not have the same conflicts. And there's definitely a need for coordination across different stakeholders. And we suggested this, you know, through discussions with different stakeholders, setting up a kind of a protocol that Elena mentioned as well, a clear and detailed protocol for detention staff and medical staff, and the administration generally, to identify mandatory steps that need to be taken where there is an allegation of violence. So a kind of automatic response where there is a report of violence, that takes it out of the hands of a discretion that can be exercised due to conflicts of interest, rather than for the interest of the person who's been a victim of violence, and really limit the arbitrariness that we see in terms of reporting by staff, even when they're aware. And in this context, and I'll wrap up on very quickly now, I think that I don't know if people have seen, there was an exceptional trial in Belgium in 2019 in respect of a group of 22 prison guards in one of the Brussels prisons of Forêt, which is really illustrative of this problem, the lack of reporting and the difficulty for the criminal legal system to grasp this problem. This trial involved 22 prison guards who, as well as a former prison director, and it related to incidents that took place over years where detainees were beaten, were made to undress in front of people, of staff, were subject to these games, a Russian roulette type game that was used to identify prisoners who would be insulted, humiliated, and beaten on a daily basis, more or less, by this specific group of guards who called themselves the SS team and who were led apparently by some a guard who was in particular. And the victims were all vulnerable in the sense that they often had mental health issues and were not able to speak French. And apparently this was widely known by many people and over years and years and years, and it had been subject to repeated complaints and no action was taken until finally a police unit who was in the prison more to investigate drug trafficking situation picked this up. And it was a very committed officer whom I met, and she explained the struggle to convince her own colleagues that this mattered and this needed to be investigated. And then it took a committed prosecutor to finally bring charges. And eventually in 2019, the majority were convicted and sentenced for inhumane and degrading treatment and acts of violence. But the broader objective here is about the need to change this culture of detention, not necessarily bringing more prosecutions, which cannot solve the issue of violence in any sustainable or systematic way. And for this, I think that restorative justice solutions very much need to be explored in collaboration with other groups. Just highlighting here Article 12, paragraph 2 of the Victims' Rights Directives, which refers to the obligation of member states to facilitate referral of cases, and also a Council of Europe recommendation of 2018, which sees that the use of restorative practices can be used to resolve conflicts between prisoners or between prisoners and prison officers. So this could be a very interesting way forward to help work towards preventing violence, work towards preventing this culture of detention on a much more long-term and systemic way, and to restore the dignity of the people involved, which is key to reintegration. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Laure, for this presentation. And this was not the first time that I heard this report, but I think it's still very impressive and kind of shocking in a way. And on another hand, I think it's probably not only the prison context where these mechanisms play a role, but in any institutional setting where power imbalance is present. And I think your findings might be also understood in this wider context. And I'm very happy that you mentioned restorative justice that has a potential to maybe somehow stop this cycle of violence and to create that kind of climate or culture in these institutional settings or in detention that needs to achieve more systemic change in the